Okay, everyone, I think that's 7:30 now. So welcome again to the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre and another instalment of our Tuesday Talks programme. I'm Scott Canavy, the Marketing Coordinator for the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. And we're joined tonight by Phenomena Magazine editor Brian Allan. Now, for the past 45 years, Brian Allan has had an abiding interest and hands-on involvement in the world of paranormal and occult phenomena. He has had remarkable experiences and has written 12 books, all dealing with various aspects of the paranormal in one way or another. Now, one of those books shares its title with tonight's presentation, Dark Messiah. Dark Messiah attempts to break down old paradigms to filter them into a variety of possibilities and new interpretations of data. It examines the relationship between religion and mystical and magical traditions. It's been called an insightful study of the unseen nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality, which, if you've been following along with us, is a topic which we've been exploring ourselves throughout this season of talks, which have aimed to open your mind to new ways of approaching and understanding the universe and reality in which you live. So I shall now hand you over to Brian Allan. Please remember, as Natalie says, that if you have any questions, to put them in the chat, and I'll ask them at the end. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Well, this presentation and the book that it comes from was intended to show that there's virtually no difference whatsoever between religion and magic. They're both, if you like, branches of the same thing. And it's also probable that magic works as another form of technology because, as the late Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And the only reason that it stopped working, I believe, is because we stopped believing that it did. So we can ask ourselves, what is magic? You notice the spelling I've used is M-A-G-I-C-K. It's quite an old-fashioned spelling, but I've used it deliberately because we don't want to confuse it with stage magic or trickery or illusion that you see conjurers using. This is something else. But it's short and sweet, and there's many definitions, but in my opinion, it is the ability to change or edit reality by an act of will alone, which is pretty much the same as the magician Aleister Crowley used to use. What he said was a bit more wordy, but that's what it boiled down to. In fact, you've got Sir James Frazer, who was the social anthropologist and the writer of the absolutely colossal work, the Golden Bough. I've got a copy of it on my bookshelf, but that's just one small volume. It originally ran to 12 volumes. Now, what Frazer said was that magic is the bastard sister of science. It is therefore a truism, almost a tautology, to say that magic is necessarily false and barren, because were it ever to become true and fruitful, it would no longer be magic, but science. And that is the absolute last thing that science wants to admit, that magic has any basis or can be proven to be real, because their own paradigms go right out the window along with it. So, what is religion? Again, it's fairly short and sweet. It's a system of belief in an all-powerful deity, but based on ancient traditions that allowed magic to be widely accepted by society, or bring them into society, if you will. Now, as far as we're concerned, for the sake of, to take this easily, it's monotheism. We'll regard religion as monotheistic. Monotheistic religion has been one God, one supreme deity, and that's been around for around 3,000 years or so. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to concentrate on the Christian, in this case the Catholic Church, not, I can assure you, for any negative reasons, but because it is also one of the longest established and perhaps a highest profile version of Christianity around. There are Eastern Orthodox Christian variants that claim to be older, but we're going to stick to this one. Now, the Church always has had an uneasy relationship with non-approved mysticism and magic, but In 1489, at the instruction of Pope Innocent VII, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who was a Renaissance philosopher, finally produced a treatise which proposed two approved magical variants. One was called theurgy, or divine magic, and the other one was called legiotia, or demonic magic. One was approved, another was condemned and banned. Now, it's as well to dwell on legiotia because it's probably the more interesting of the two, because it's certainly most notorious, because Gotia means literally howling, because the practitioners shrieked and bellowed their invocations at the very top of their voices. And there's an old saying that you do not find the Gotia finds you. Now, these magical practices of theurgy and legiotia came under what the church called the operation of the stars. From this it classified the practice of alchemy as the operation of the sun and astrology as the operation of the moon. Now, according to the church's definition, alchemy was male and astrology was female. Now, both disciplines, although they were still viewed with some suspicion, were now legitimate sciences because they were based on forms of esoteric Christianity. And those who chose to follow these routes were accepted as adepts. They were alchemists and astrologists. I use the word astrologist deliberately rather than astrologer because this was before the very concept of astrology was actually thought of. They used information gained from, quote, higher beings for the glorification of God in particular, and the benefit of humanity was just a byproduct of this. It can be difficult to decide whether religion legitimized magic or magic legitimized religion, but logic seems to suggest that it's the second of the two options, because animistic and shamanic traditions long predate any form of religion. And if one casts aside prejudice, it's absolutely obvious that religion and magic are one and the same thing. This is particularly true when one considers the ceremonies and rituals used by the Roman Catholic Church as it functions from day to day. There are rituals that have more than a passing similarity to magical rites, and I'll be looking very closely at one in particular a little bit later. Now, the Church has never been ever been anything other than pragmatic. So let's pause and look at this. For example, in AD 601, Pope Gregory ordered that certain pagan traditions be adopted into church dogma to help neutralize competing belief systems. And existing festivals, for example, Samhain became Halloween, and it went on this way. It was virtually a case of keeping your friends close, but your enemies closer still. However, being very pragmatic, as I say, the ones that adopt these traditions into its own canon of belief, the church vilified the pagans as heretics and Satanists, and therefore helped to create a following of fearful and compliant sinners. So how did this all come about? Well, there were various ways that this came about, but the first was the idea of fertility as expressed with the horned god Pan, also called Cernunnos. Pan became Satan, who was the source and cause of all evil, and Satan was entirely an invention of the Christian church. It was very convenient because it could then make comparisons between the benevolent God and the very evil Satan. But this only applied to the New Testament God because the Old Testament one was a murderous psychopath, the archetypal jealous God. Besides, the Judaic roots of Christianity had no Satan, but they did have a Hasatan, or an adversary, but this had no physical form. It certainly had no horns or fangs or a big forky tail. It was a sort of a trickster figure often found in folklore. In fact, the roots of Judaism found the idea of Satan as being a force equal to that of God extremely offensive, because they didn't see how you could possibly set up a Satan to be the equal of God, because as far as they were concerned, this didn't happen. And others thought that Satan was an allegory, representing a crisis of faith or even free will and enlightenment. In fact, in 1960, there was a confidential survey was carried out among Catholic priests concerning the existence of Satan, and a surprising 80% of them said they did not accept that Satan was an entity in its own right. They said Satan was a state of mind. But you should keep in mind what Baudelaire said, that Satan's greatest achievement is convincing people that he doesn't exist. Maybe worth keeping in mind. Then there was this guy, Father Ernesto Pisoni, SJ, Society of Jesus, who was a Jesuit. And again, looking at pragmatism in the church. In the 1990s, the church granted dispensation to this Monsignor Ernesto Pisoni, the Jesuit theologian, in fact, to hold seances in the Vatican. Pisoni is a former editor of the Catholic newspaper L'Italia. Now, Monsignor Pisoni found that one, there is life after death, and that two, ghosts do coexist with the living. This was a direct result of these seances that he carried out in the Vatican, but there's not been a lot said about that because much of it was highly inconvenient. So let's look again at how magical beliefs took hold in the dawn of magic. Our forefathers tried to make sense of the world around them and tried to exert some sort of control over their own environment. First came the Animus, who basically thought that all objects that were natural had a spirit, even the cosmos itself. All, in a sense, were conscious. And philosophers like Plato and Pythagoras believed that immaterial forces animated the universe, hence the term animist. The Pythagorean teachings are still the foundations of many types of magic. In fact, the ubiquity of number is a good example of this, at least of the ancient magical science of gematria. Now, and very basically, in gematria, you apply letters to numbers. A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3. That's a bit of a simplification, but basically that's how it works. And you find that words and sentences with similar meanings have identical numerical values. At first, I didn't believe that. And it was a guy that actually convinced me, a guy called Bill Downey. You should actually get him on sometime. Bill Downey showed me, he sat with the Bible and he sat with other stuff, and he took the words and phrases out of the Bible, used his calculator, and he showed me that for some reason, these words and sentences with a similar meaning had identical numerical values, and amazingly they did. Because I think the accuracy and precision of number compared to language can describe everything down to the atomic level, because although language, and especially the English language, is remarkably rich, it is limited, but only, as I say, mathematics can take you right down to the atomic level. And in fact, I believe that possibly mathematics is the only effective form that will ever be of Esperanto. Anyway, after the Animus came the shamans. They were the spiritual teachers and healers who were the first practical magicians. Now, some evolved into dynasties of priest kings whose control was based on magic, which, if not overt, was covert. And with that came the seeds of Gnostic belief.
Brian, sorry to interrupt you. Is there any way?
Sorry?
Well, I've just had a couple of messages just to say that I find it quite hard to follow. Just are you able to speak a little bit slower?
Okay. I thought I was. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, I'll take this back to the dawn of magic.
Thanks, Brian.
As above, so below. This is the ultimate and essential magic and Gnostic truth. It has various strands, but it is based on spiritual understanding and knowledge and gnosis. And gnosis, of course, is the search for all of it. All magicians are Gnostics. Gnosis is part and parcel of magic. In most cases, it is achieved via trance states when the magician, if you like, or the Gnostic tries to communicate with the spirit realm. The concept of as above, so below was also hijacked by the church and altered to suit, and it became in heaven as it is on earth. It means exactly the same thing. Now, Gnosticism at core is dualistic, and it teaches that there are two gods, one is pure and the other is not. Now, the Cathars were Gnostics, as indeed were the Bogomils. Now, the Gnostics believed that the cosmos was created by an imperfect God, the demiurge or the Rex Mundi, or the God of the world, who in effect became the model for Satan. Now, the real God, who was the God of the Gnostic believers, was perfect and of pure spirit. And this is what they tried to emulate physically. Sometimes the methods were quite drastic, sometimes relatively benign by involving celibacy, and at other times it was castration, which is a bit severe, I suppose. Now, the Gnostics were also vegetarians. This was not because of any love for the suffering of animals, but because animals were the product of, if you like, of sex, I suppose, and they were dead against that. So this is why they didn't choose to eat animals. They just ate, non-meat products, shall we say. This meant that by Gnostic standards, physical representations of God, religious artifacts, statues, churches and cathedrals, etc., were inherently impure. and the one tainted with something unclean. This was an absolute anathema to the Catholic Church and was immediately condemned as heresy. But to be fair, the Church did try to change their minds, but it couldn't. And it did this by sending priests out into the highways and byways and try to bring the flock back into the fold again. But the priests actually saw the attractions of Gnosticism, and some became Gnostic themselves. The Gnostics in the search for spiritual enlightenment and knowledge, no form of magic can exist without gnosis, which is a bit of a simplification. But the seeker of gnosis strives to achieve harmony and understanding of the cosmos and what governs it, and tries to become one with it. So how did it develop from there? Well, although science became legitimized through alchemy and mathematics and slowly lost its magical overtones, pure magic simply did not go away. And by the way, the Church was extremely suspicious of mathematics because it could prove its dogmas to be totally and utterly wrong. Now, amongst its various ploys, the Church, of course, used the Inquisition. We'll have a quick look at that in the way past because it's actually quite interesting. Now, the Church, the Inquisition was run completely and entirely by the Dominican order, which were created specifically to actually manage the Inquisition. But it's how the Church imposed its orthodoxy through the use of violence and torture. Now, the meaning of heretic is not complicated. It means one who chooses. A heretic literally is one who chooses. That's all it means. Now, at one point, sadly, the charge of heresy meant torture and or death through the various inquisition when the unfortunate was put to the question. Now, these questions were so loaded that you were damned if you answered and you were damned if you didn't. For example, the poor sod was asked, "Do you believe in witchcraft?" If they tried to get out of it and said, "No, I don't," well, that was the wrong thing to say because the Church did, so that was an immediate heresy. So you're immediately a heretic again, so we'll torture you. It was actually quicker to say, yes, you did. They just got on with it anyway, because either way you're going to get tortured. But the thing is, there were two forms of the question. There was the question. Now, at one point, the torturer might decide you'd had enough and give up and said, well, okay, you've admitted your faults, we'll let you out. But then there was the extraordinary question. And that means the torture continued until you died. That was the kind of animals and fools that these superstitious brutes were at the time. Now, as far as the Inquisitions are concerned, most people have heard of Thomas de Torquemada. He was an evil, merciless and superstitious tyrant, and he created a climate of fear similar to that created by the KGB and the Gestapo in the Second World War. It was all about control through absolute fear. Now, Torquemada was so hated by the people that he travelled with a permanent retinue of 300 armed guards who guarded him day and night, because if the people could have got to him, they would have torn them apart. However, the concept of the Inquisition, like most of these things, was quite a good idea, depending on whose side you were on. And was later adopted by other strains of Christianity, the Protestant faith and the Puritans, who had the witch finders and so forth, which was, if you like, another form of the Inquisition. By the way, Islam and Judaism, for that matter, also recognized magic because the early grimoires were written in Arabic and Hebrew. However, as we will see, the use of magic in everyday life has been more common than you actually think. But first, some more of the background about what was called the magical courts, because the spread of magic in Europe in the Dark and Middle Ages was relentless, and eventually it reached the highest in the land. Got to King Louis XIV. Now, as far as that was concerned, his mistress was Madame de Montespan, and she used magic to retain her favoured place in the hierarchy of the court, and it was a pretty backbiting job, I can tell you, because they were all striving to get up the king's bed. Now, the gossip surrounding the machinations of de Montespan and her associates uncovered yet another major scandal that was called the Affair of the Poisons. All of this came about as a direct result of the continuous pressure within the court circle to create, maintain, and then defend the social standing of individual courtiers. The outrages began with an inexplicable series of deaths among the aristocracy and ended up with charges of murder, poisoning, and witchcraft being directed at the inner circle surrounding the king himself. Now, the king, appreciating his own position, was understandably concerned and safeguarded himself, but in addition surrounding himself with soldiers, also appointed some unfortunate servants as food tasters. Now, if nothing else, that they'd be eating decent food, providing they weren't getting poisoned, and most of them didn't, I can assure you that. But the king eventually set up a special committee called the Chambre Ardente, or the Burning Court, to examine charges. And examining the charges, he produced a crop of suspects. The main one was this, Catherine de Saint-Monvoisin, who just became called La Voisin. She was a midwife and therefore a witch, because as far as the church was concerned, midwives and witches were virtually the same thing. Now, midwives are also referred to as wise women, in other words, healers who could help the pain of childbirth, which immediately was a no-no as far as the church was concerned. So they were witches. The Catholic Church attitude to childbirth at the time, and in fact, until relatively recently, in fact, as late as the 18th century, I should add, they made no attempt to ease the pain of childbirth, based on their specious nonsense that because Eve had no pain relief at childbirth, neither should anybody else. However, the Virgin Mary had no pain at her birth because the birth was miraculous. Now, Lavoisin had been married to an unsuccessful businessman and tried to contribute to the family coffers, initially by prostitution, then by palm reading and other forms of divination. Now, as her fame, or that should be infamy, grew, she began to dabble in witchcraft, and along with two accomplices, she began supplying aphrodisiacs and poisons as well. I should say that poisons were sometimes rather jocularly referred to as inheritance powders for very obvious reasons. Now, during her interrogation, which was conducted by keeping her permanently drunk and knocking her about a bit, not surprisingly, she implicated quite a number of people. And one of her accomplices, this guy, was a defrocked priest called Etienne Guibourg. Abbé Guibourg, who was also accused of officiating at many of the black masses. Now, because a priest is defrocked, in other words, excommunicated and forbidden to say the mass, this does not mean that they are any less of a priest, because they're still privy to any rituals and techniques involved in their training. Now, the details of the black masses particularly nauseated the public and became added to the worst form of spiritual blasphemy. The Black Mass was a powerful version and travesty of the Catholic Mass, and because the traditional Mass was seen as immensely powerful then, it certainly was, so would any perversion of it. And it also involves satanic invocations and the ritual murder, torture, and disembowelment of babies and children. See, the thing is that people believed that the literal word of Scripture, you have to remember that the Catholic Mass was almost unique and a tremendously powerful spiritual weapon, a tool, if you like. It continually invoked all sorts of instances of form of magical spells, everything from curing illnesses to saving lives, to finding those who were lost and even winning wars. And as we shall see, even winning wars is actually included towards the end of this in a very, very surprising way. It's also been stated that when a search was carried out of Lavoisin's garden, dozens of sets of remains were discovered, although she admitted to carrying out thousands, although that's extremely unlikely. Probably during torture, I would imagine she would have said anything that they wanted her to say. Prior to this era, France was a cordon of magical practices. And you had this guy, Gilles de Rais, a powerful man, influential, highly influential, in fact. He was a colleague of Joan of Arc. He was a Marshal of France, and he was also a template for Bluebeard. However, he was also a black magician of the worst sort. He was a paedophile and serial child killer. He was responsible for some truly hellish excesses of murder and killing in the name of achieving sexual gratification. I'm not going to go into what he did because it was absolutely foul. He was eventually arrested and burned at the stake, but his crimes and excesses went on for years. And actually, he did recant at the point of his death, and many of the crowd were in tears because he claimed that he was possessed. And given some of the stuff that he was involved in, he might well have been, but it's suggested that he was in fact possessed. But the Catholic Church had its own types of magic. There were two that were sanctioned by the Church, and they were used quite legitimately, but still in secret. One was this, the Mass of the Holy Spirit. This traces its roots back to the first Jesuit school in Messina in 1548, and there was a belief that priests could control elemental forces of earth, wind, fire, and water, but usually for beneficial purposes. And although just permissible, it was still taboo, and they had to receive special permission to conduct the ritual and be absolved of its after effects. It was rather like the traditional ceremony of exorcism, the ritual Romanum, or the Roman ritual. Another approved form of church magic was the Mass of St. Zacchaeus. It's an extreme example of church magic, and it was little known about even amongst the priesthood, but it originated in Gascony in France. It was designed to produce an evil outcome, usually the death of the person against whom the Mass was said. It wasn't black magic exactly, but it wasn't all that far away. It was usually said by a defrocked priest using prostitutes as assistants, and also a desecrated host. Usually a piece of rotten turnip was a sort of favourite. Because priests were assumed to have magical power because if they could cast out demons during exorcism, logically they could also theoretically summon them too. But moving to a bit closer to our time, we've got this guy, Augustus Montague Summers, quite a character. He was one of the more colourful characters. He was formerly an Anglican, but he claimed to be a Catholic priest, but he wasn't. He was a priest in what was called the Old Catholic Church. This church still exists, and it condones and promotes a homosexual lifestyle, but has absolutely no connection with the Catholic Church except in its name. Now, whilst he was in the Old Catholic Church, he adopted the name Father Alphonsus Jesus Mary Augustus Montague Summers. And he also joined something called the Order of Quirinius, which may give a clearer understanding of his original motives in joining the Old Catholic Church. The Order of Quirinius was founded in 1897 by George Cecil Ives to promote homosexuality with a cultural and spiritual ethos. It was a concept which at the time was totally anathema to the general public, well, not so much now, obviously. Now, Summers, to give you an idea of what you're dealing with here, Summers thoroughly approved of the Inquisition and considered that pagans, witches, Wiccans, and Satanists as one and the same thing. And in fact, he called them worshippers of Satan, blasphemers, rapists, charlatans, bawds, and abortionists. So he clearly wasn't in favour of them. He was also convinced of the literal existence of vampires and werewolves. He was also a friend of Alistair Crowley and also met up socially with him to compare notes and consult with one another. This is surprising to me since we're both supreme egotists. He also knew Dennis Wheatley. Now, Wheatley is on record in saying that he was absolutely terrified of him, and he used him for the template of Canon Copley Styles in the book The Devil Rides Out and later the film, obviously. Is it fair to classify exorcism with magic? Well, yes, because it uses the same ritualistic techniques and prayers and spells. Here you've got Father Gabriel Amort and Father Michael Malachi Martin, SJ. He was obviously a Jesuit. Both now dead, but they're two well-known exorcists they were. Now, Gabriel Amort, he was one time the official Vatican exorcist, and the other, Malachi Martin, was an influential priest and a former Jesuit who left the Jesuit order but claimed that the Jesuits left him. They were both ultra-traditionalists who became disillusioned at the time of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, and Malachi Martin thought the Jesuits had become far too left-leaning. And what is one of the reasons he left? He actually called the Jesuits communists. It's been suggested, of course, that the Jesuits are left-wing, while Opus Dei, with other church organisation, is right-wing, and both battle continually for control of the Vatican, therefore its spiritual and political direction. Malachi Martin claims to perform thousands of exorcisms, he probably has, many without official approval, and it was also said to be the model of Father Merrin in the film The Exorcist. And he gave the impression that demonic possession was widespread but unrecognised in the USA. Now, Gabriel Amort allegedly performed around 7,000 exorcisms, and having mentioned The Exorcist, Amort thoroughly thought the film was actually absolutely brilliant, and it gave a very accurate impression of what exorcism was like, and suggested it should be a required viewing for any priest that wanted to be an exorcist, because they were going to learn a good deal about their craft from the film. And if anyone's seen it, they'll know exactly what I was talking about. Was Jesus a magician? Well, some magical traditions have the idea that a king has to die in order that the people should benefit. Now, the ultimate priest-king was Jesus, who was officially crucified as a political agitator, but also, more importantly, as a maleficus or a magician. He certainly ticks all the boxes to be a magician, because the many miracles he performed were examples of magic by any other name. The wedding feast at Canaan, feeding the 5,000, raising the dead, and so forth and so on. Now, the Romans were well aware that death by crucifixion was the most agonizing means of execution possible. It still is. And the name was so synonymous with pain that it sort of devolved into the English language to describe excruciating pain. In other words, excruciating from ex crucis, of the cross. So that's how that word actually came into being, from crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was exclusively reserved for magicians, and frequently, but not always, for those who threatened the state. The Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, claimed that Jesus was a magician to guarantee his death, because the Roman authorities would have no choice other than to actually put him to death because of that, because magic they disapproved of heartily. If they did this, it was a serious mistake on their part, because crucifixion allowed the development and growth of his system of belief. In effect, he died so that he could live. This ancient tradition applies to all hero figures, and Jesus also ticks that box. He was the archetypal hero, the dying and rising God, which is a powerful agnostic symbol of death and rebirth. It's also why Christianity is actually a sun-based religion. The sun rises, the sun sets, dying and rising. Now, we mentioned that religion and magic are the same thing. So is the priest, or any other clergy for that type of matter, whether Christian or not, the same as a magician. Well, let's return to the Catholic Mass for a minute, and transubstantiation. Now, during the Vatican II meetings, the Latin or Tridentine Mass, along with much else, was dropped, except for the form of words used during the ritual of transubstantiation and, oddly enough, exorcism in the ritual Romanum. The transubstantiation is designed to bring about the literal presence of God or Christ on the altar. The invocation for transubstantiation is this: Hoc estinum corpus meum, for this is my body. Hic estinum calix sanguis me, for this is the chalice of my blood. In saying these words, the priest becomes Christ or acts the channel for him, and this was not changed from the Latin in any way. Well, why? Because these were the words of Christ himself at the Last Supper, and they've become words of power over the millennia through repeated use in this context. Actually, in fact, these words would have been in Aramaic, which is the language of Christ, and not Latin, which is the language of Rome, but that's how they've come down to in Latin. This implies that any type of ritual language can become charged with immense latent power and in effect become spells, which are sometimes assembled as collections of grimoires. The grimoires, do not underestimate the power of these tomes. Because of what they contain, they were said to be powerful in their own right. The actual grimoire, the book itself, contained power. Some contained instructions on the proper care and consecration, and they had to be looked after in a very specific way. The destruction of a grimoire is the same as an exorcism or even execution. And the medieval accounts tell of the sky turning black and screams being heard when grimoires were burned. This one, the grimoire of Pope Honorius the third, dates from approximately 1670 and incorporates ideas drawn from many earlier works. It was noted by the magician Eliphas Levi, whose name was actually Louis Alphonse Constant, as the most evil book in magic ever published, and given the nature of other grimoires, that is quite a claim. The book itself deals with the invocation of rebellious angels by means of necromancy, in other words, by invoking the dead. Although necromancy is widely known and used, it can also be associated with some techniques used by spiritualist mediums. And this is one of the reasons that the mediums and psychics are sometimes mistrusted, because they're communing in effect with spirits of the dead. Here's another example of a grimoire, the Lesser Key of Solomon. It's also called the Lemegegeton, and it first appeared around 1641. A number of books, one of which is the Gosha, which we encountered at the beginning of this presentation. Then you had John Dee's 5 books of mystery. John Dee, 1588, was actually written between 1581 and 1583. And Dr. John Dee was a man of great influence. He was an alchemist, he was a polymath, in fact, a magician, an astronomer, a mathematician, and also a spy for Queen Elizabeth I. He also created this, the Enochian language, the symbols used there. If you look at the left-hand side there, you'll see these symbols all joined together. They've become what they call the sigils, which in effect are spells reduced to just a form. Each of these forms, all these marks, are actually spells in their own right. It's also, however, more likely that it was used as a code that he used in his spying exploits. Another one you have here is the Book of Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. This dates from the mid-15th century and involves the teachings of the Egyptian mage Abramelin. It describes a form of powerful but relatively peaceful Kabbalistic magic and features prominently in both the practice of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and other types of the organization late the Golden Dawn. However, there are modern variants on these old, quite humorous, on these old grimoires. One is this, the Necronomicon, which was, of course, created by H.P. Lovecraft as a work of fiction. Now, why would I include this book as a work of fiction? Well, it was so good and Lovecraft wrote so well that even though it didn't exist, some writers thought that it should. So they actually wrote one. There were a couple of guys did this. Colin Wilson was one. And the ideas in it are largely inspired by Sumerian mythology and the Ars Gotia, which is a section in the Lesser Key of Solomon. Now, appropriately enough, and given the nature of what Lovecraft wrote about, this work concerns summoning demons. Now, the sigil that you see there at the top above the word Necronomicon, I've only ever seen it one other place other than this book, and it was here, on the neck of Vin Diesel in the film Babylon AD, because he was a pretty bad guy. And I sometimes wonder about the guys who do these films, because they are very, very well clued up on kind of stuff that goes on. So they decided that Vin Diesel should have this tattoo on the side of the neck for the sake of the film. Now, Crowley gets back in the act again, and 2 of his books, Magic in Theory and Practice and the Book of the Law. These are 2 grimoires by Crowley, and they're probably the most accessible works on this extremely esoteric subject, because both are at least readable and designed to show how a system of Thelema works. They are, as I say, they're easy to read, and I suppose the thrill seeker could actually read them, because the other books are not written, and they're written almost impenetrable. I've tried reading them, you can't read them, not unless you really wanted to, because they're so obscure and they go off in all directions, you just give up and you say, oh, this isn't worth it. And it's probably just as well. I think it's to protect the innocent just from dabbling about and this kind of stuff, because it's highly dangerous. Grimoire of Chaos Magic. Now, Chaos Magic is probably the closest anyone will ever come to the power source of all magic, and I do mean all magic, because all other types of magic are based on chaos magic. Remember that the Bible was drawn from many Hermetic and Gnostic traditions. As we have seen, Gnosis is vital to the operation of magic, and depending on how it's used, the Bible has been associated with being a grimoire. The same with the Quran and the Torah. They are also being used in magical ceremonies. And rabbis and imams can also function as sorcerers. And I've already said that the earliest magical writings were in Hebrew and Arabic, and there's plenty of evidence to support this. So what now? Well, If we can at least consider that religion and magic have a common source, is there hope of any reconciliation? Well, the answer is probably not. If you consider that paganism, Wicca, and nature worship are all fundamental magical truths that did not create wars, conducting human tortures, or impose their own version of right and wrong, but intolerant, vengeful monotheism did, and with a will, and it still does to a certain extent. You've only got to look at what happened with ISIS and so forth. An example of the destruction of the statues of the Buddha by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also Palmyra in Syria by ISIS. These beautiful ancient statues and buildings long predated both the Taliban and Islam. You see, I believe that the answer is a return to pagan and shamanistic values, to the old ways. Especially in the secular culture that we live in, we need it for our own spiritual survival. Because the old ways can be seen and touched, and one can interact with them. Whereas materialism and rationalism starve us, and they try to fill it with, well, what exactly? The latest app for your phone, the latest TV set, whatever, the latest computer. Is the way to salvation through acquisition? Well, apparently it is if you follow these prophets on God TV, the televangelists. We've got some examples of them here. Now, these guys promote what's called prosperity theology, which means God wants you to be rich, so just give us your money. Now, Don Stewart, Benny Hinn, Ted Haggard, and Tammy Faye Baker are all examples of this prosperity theology. Now, Don Stewart flogs what he calls a prosperity handkerchief. You buy this and you get rich right away. Now, Benny Hinn delivers a sort of overheated form of deliverance ministry, more like the World Wrestling Federation than anything else. Haggard just wants your money, and the rather, well, elaborate-looking Tammy Faye Baker, who sometimes confuses the money for her ministry on her own, and in fact her husband went to jail and was fined $500,000 for embezzlement. But you just have a look at Benny Hinn just in the passing, or Reverend Hinn. Here he is, slaying about him in the spirit and doing his stuff. He made several prophecies, predictions, did the Reverend Hinn. I use Reverend in the very loosest possible sense. He predicted that Fidel Castro would die in the 1990s. It'd be worse than any death you could imagine. He didn't. He prophesied that God would destroy all homosexuals by fire, I might add, in America no later than 1995. He did not. And the east coast of the United States would be utterly destroyed by earthquakes. It was not. All the usual claims of death and destruction are made by the Lord whispering in his ear. Well, certainly the Lord must be taking the mickey out of him, I suppose, he's having a laugh at his expense. Now, the whole idea of prosperity ministry is based on a very strange interpretation of Scripture. But the fundamentalist evangelical preachers who give the interpretation as the truth because they can get away with it. Religion can be presented as a fact, and there's no need of proof of any kind for any claim, no matter how unlikely or ridiculous. Believe and you become rich. Believe in us and we can cure your cancer and even raise the dead. And if this is not promoting magic, then what is it doing? In fact, Benny Hinn, who you see there, once said that on the Trinity Broadcasting Network, that if the coffins with the dead were brought to the television set while he was preaching, the dead would get out their coffins and even become alive again. That's the kind of nonsense the man talks. But there's an audience for that kind of stuff, and they'll lap up and believe it. The thing is, if Wiccans or pagans did the same thing, they'd be in jail or in court for making fraudulent claims. Now, while on this subject of magic, let's look at something else. The military application I actually talked about at the beginning. We're looking at Acog Gun Sites, or Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sites made with the Trigicon company. Now, these gun sights, which are very good, I might add, the best you can get for what they do, they use a sighting element, which is a radioactive element called tritium or tritium. It glows in the dark, in other words, so it doesn't need batteries or anything to actually to illuminate, so the soldier can actually see down them and see what they're doing. Now, what's this got to do with religion and magic and right-wing Christian evangelism? Well, here's one example, perhaps, where inadvertently Scripture is used as an invocation. These are the stock numbers used on these guns. They've got scriptural references in them. There are 2 Corinthians 4:6 and John 8:12 encoded This was done to help the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I should say that the guy that owns this company is a Christian fundamentalist. Now, both of them make reference to the fact that light is generated by these gun sites. I won't read them both, but I'll go for 2 Corinthians 4:6. For God, who said, let light shine of this darkness, make his light shine in our hearts to give us the light and the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face. All very good. Now, these sites, now I should add that the guy probably had no idea what he was doing, was actually using a magical invocation here, which was what he was actually doing. He was invoking the Bible to act as an act of war, if you like. The sites were originally bought and used by the US Marines and sections of the British Army, but no longer. And in fact, these numbers have been taken out of the actual order of the actual stock numbers, because if nothing else, it would have been a spectacular propaganda coup for Islamic terrorists. So in conclusion, guys, the human race has been on this planet for a couple of million years, give or take. And its present form, maybe 100,000 years. And animism and shamanism has been around for almost as long. Now, we said at the beginning that monotheism has been around 3,000 years or thereabouts. And that's all. The blink of an eye in cosmological terms. In that time, it has murdered millions of people. In my opinion, the answer lies in the magic of whom and what we are, and the answer lies inside of us. We only have to look. The thing that also came in mind is there is an expression, and it's worth keeping this in mind. It is battle not with monsters. Pardon. I'm going to take a drink just now. My throat's a little bit dry. It's this. Battle not with monsters, lest you become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. And I found out to my cost that it does, which is why I tend to keep this stuff very much in the back burner. I used to be actively involved, not anymore, because I had the fright of my life once and I just stopped doing it. Okay, I'll tell you what happened. I don't know, there's maybe at least one person here that's probably heard this. If Peter's still there, Peter Bruin, if he's involved, he's heard me tell this tale before. The book this came from, when I was investigating it or researching it, I had to get involved with researching the Black Mass, and this went on for about a week until I got the information I needed, and I wrote the chapter. And I was sitting on the computer, and I literally finished the chapter, hit the stop, full stop. And instantly, I went cold from the inside out. I don't mean it took time, instantly cold. And I thought, uh-oh, because something like this had happened before. And I realized that someone had pulled something in. And in other words, something from the abyss had seen me looking and had decided to pay me a visit. Well, I wished it away and it went. I thought it went. However, it didn't. And the following morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife and I were lying in bed. And we both woke up at the same time, but just instantly wide awake. And there was something thumping around in the room. We could hear scratching on the floors, we could scratching on the walls, scratching on the ceiling. Then it went quiet in our room, and the upstairs room, which is an empty bedroom now, we could hear something thumping around in there. And we lay there terrified. It's the first time I've actually been frozen with fear. And I realized that something had been brought in. I didn't tell my wife at the time. And we both eventually went to sleep and it was okay. But I went around the house the following day and exercised every room in the house. And that was like 2 or 3 years ago. Nothing's happened since. So, as I said, if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. So, if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for the amount of detail. As Benjamin said, it's very specific and so much detail in that presentation. Quite a lot to take in. How long was how long did it take you to do the research for that?
Oh, how long was a piece of string? Oh, this book, I would guess about 6 months.
6
months to research it, yeah.
And Margaret's just asked, I think the phrase here, the first part about the monsters, was it from Frankenstein? What was that phrase again?
What phrase was that? Battle not with monsters?
Yes.
No, it's, oh gosh. I'm trying to remember who it was. It's a French philosopher battle out with monsters. Google it. I think that's what I would do. If battle not with monsters, lest you become a monster. If you Google it, you'll find out. I can't actually remember off my head who said that, but it's absolutely spot on.
Perfect. Benjamin has asked if you could speak to the use of magic and the internet.
Magic is a very personal, a one-to-one exercise, and you could. I'm not actually too sure what it actually means by that. If you means can you do magic on the internet? No, the magic would be confined to the room or the place where you were and the people you were working with, I suspect. I don't think you could use it to project over the internet. I don't think that would work.
Would the internet be a form of magic?
Sorry?
Could the internet be considered the form of magic?
Yeah. I just noticed Peter just brought it was Nietzsche. Thank you very much, Peter. Much appreciated.
I thought it was Frankenstein. Benjamin said, I am an American and I feel like our country is currently under a spell.
Do you want me to comment on that?
Yes, please.
Well, if I was going to comment on that, I would probably say that no, I better not, because I start getting personal now and it would involve the current incumbent in the White House. So I better not say any more.
I know that you've got a new book coming out. You mentioned at the start. It's called Of Gods and Men.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that's about?
It's not coming out yet. It's currently being written. And it is actually, well, Peter will know the other guy I'm talking to mention. Barry Fitzgerald and I are writing a book. We're collaborating on a book of Gods and Men, that's a working title, and it's basically the interactions that we've had with invisible entities out there that interact with us, and these entities can take any form that's suitable to the culture they're dealing with. They've been here since the beginning of time, and they've posed in different forms, I say, depending on the culture that deals with them. Pardon me, and I don't think they necessarily have our best interests at heart. But I say the book, we're only 2 or 3 chapters into it, so that's the sort of direction we're sort of heading in with it. We're not too sure where we're going to end up with it, but it's quite an interesting prospect just now because Barry's got a style of writing, and it's interesting.
Thank you. We've got some questions popping in here.
I know as Peter says.
Yes, Peter. Very interesting. The Vatican stuff. How much is the church into which I was baptized still practicing evil? Oh, how much is the church still practicing evil? He's thinking of the JP1 book, Yallop.
Oh, David Yallop. Yeah, I've read the book. Very interesting book. I don't think we should. Well, look, I was born up the Catholic Church as well. So I mean, I come from that. John Paul I. Okay. Was John Paul I assassinated? Well, I'm not the best person to talk about that probably because I don't really know. But I know the guy was in office for a very, very short space of time, and he was planning some big changes within the church. So it is possible that some very, very right-wing aspects of the church would have him killed, because it would upset their own agendas. But I don't really think that is a subject for this particular discussion.
Somebody mentioned neuro-linguistic programming. Do you think that has any relation to magic?
Neuro-linguistic programming. Oddly enough, I just read a book about that, neuro-linguistic programming. And I don't think it's got anything to do with magic, but I think it's got a lot to do with psychology. I mean, for example, I could be talking to you, and if I said a word, I would touch you. Well, maybe I'd touch your elbow on a particular word. Then when I use the word again, I'd touch your elbow. And this is programming your body to expect something to happen when this word is said. That's a very, very loose example of what NLP is about. But John Ronson, who is a writer that I greatly admire, he wrote a book called The Psychopath Test. And I think he gets on about NLP and that as well. And it's quite an interesting subject. But neurolinguistic programming and magic, nah. NLP is about psychology, not about magic. Although you could argue, I suppose, that some aspects of psychology are magical.
Thanks very much.
Oh, Bandler, it was a guy called Bandler that actually, he created NLP when I think about it.
In history, do men or women, do you think, participate more with magic? So is it quite balanced between the genders?
No. I would say that I would say it's pretty equal in both respects. Women got the bad rap for it because of the misogyny that exists and still exists to some extent, where women got the blame for everything. Nothing much changes, I suppose. Women, you've got to go back in time a little bit here, because the church was actually the church was very, very bad for this. Extremely misogynistic, because they were afraid of women. Basically, they were terrified of women and the power that women had or perceived to have. So they gave them a bad rap. That's why witches were invariably women. This is why the church, at its core, and especially in the early days, not so much now, although it's not that much better, it's still intensely misogynistic, I would say. But no, the breakdown between women and men and magic is, I would say, is 50-50.
Okay. Peter has just said the US airmen and women who were involved in the Rendlesham Forest incident, who were given the treatment afterwards, were allegedly given trigger words to control them. If magic is about control, then so is this.
That again is well, the control was, you're starting to go down a different road altogether now. You're starting to talk, you're starting to go down like Stargate Project, you're starting to go down MK Ultra, you're starting to go down all sorts of roads involving control. I don't necessarily think that well, we all have people's words for what happened at Rendlesham. All I can say about the Rendlesham Forest incident is did something happen there? Yes, it did, without a shadow of a doubt. Was it extraterrestrial? Was it extra-dimensional? It could have been both of these things. But as far as the trigger words are concerned, I don't think that's magic. That, again, is psychology, and I don't think psychology and magic are the same thing. Magic, as I say, is the art of altering reality to your wishes by an act of will alone. That's what I think magic actually is.
Thank you. Well, thanks, sir. I think that's all the questions for now. I think everyone else is under a spell at the moment. But thanks very much, Brian. It's Brian Allan, the editor of Phenomena magazine. If you join us next week, we'll be having Connie McLaughlin from the BBC, who'll be talking to us about her own spiritual journey in a talk called The Search for Truth. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Brian.
You're more than welcome, guys. And no doubt I'll be talking to Peter this coming Friday.
Perfect. Bye, all.
You're welcome, guys. Thank you. It's been a genuine pleasure. God bless. Take care.